Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Spear, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm glad to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss the Carney government's decision to recognize Palestinian statehood, including its causes and consequences for Canada and the Middle East itself. On the first half of the show, we'll talk about what it means for Canada, including the different factors behind the decision. On the back half, exclusive for Hub Fellows and Hub Heroes, we'll discuss the effect of the Prime Minister's announcement, including in the context of ongoing negotiations with the Trump administration. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you, Sean.
David, let's start, if you will, with your overall reaction to the decision by the Carney government. One that, it must be said, its predecessor, the Trudeau government, resisted.
Yeah.
Why now? What has changed in your mind?
I have two theories about what's going on. One, which is not very creditable, but is kind of smart. And the other of which is a little bit more idealistic, but kind of dumb. So the not very creditable, but smart theory is that the Carney government has figured out, they've just done a electoral calculus, that in the ridings they need to win that are reachable for Liberals, that Israel has become a vote loser, and it's time to switch sides. And if that's the decision, again, I can't endorse it as a moral decision. I think they're joining the wrong side, but they also are obviously very astute at reading their own political fortunes, and they've made then a calculus that makes sense. But there's a horrible possibility, which is that it's not a cynical decision. The horrible possibility is that Carney and Macron and Starmer have talked themselves into a complicated plan with these three governments will, in conjunction with the Arab League pushing pressure on the Hamas, work out this peace fantasy that will bypass Israel and the United States and do what they're always doing and come to these terms that sound so sensible if you're at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York or at a conference in Geneva, but have no relevance to what is actually happening in the region.
Let me put a third scenario on the table, one incidentally that you raised in a previous conversation, and that is the announcement is in keeping with the past practice of the federal Liberal Party, which at times leans a bit to the right on economic and fiscal issues, and then nods to its left-wing elements on foreign policy. To what extent do you think that may be what's happening here?
Again, that would go under they know what they're doing umbrella. And there's a real possibility they don't. Look, what the Carney government has done, it needs to be said, is they haven't said they're going to recognize. This is the part that is where they sort of baffle me. They don't say we're going to recognize a Palestinian state.
Yes.
They say we will recognize a Palestinian state provided that state meets a certain number of conditions. And it's a long list: demilitarization and end of and it all reminds me. It all reminds me of a classic Shtetl joke. So Yossi the carpenter has an unmarriageable son. The boy's a dreamer. He's obviously never going to make a living. No one in the village will marry their daughter to Yossi the carpenter's son. And in desperation, Yossi pays a big fee to the village matchmaker to find somebody who will take his boy off his hands. And the matchmaker thinks and works and canvasses, and it's frustrating at first, but eventually she has a brainstorm. And she comes to Yossi and says, look, your boy, he's never going to make a living. He needs a rich wife. I think I found the person for him, the daughter of Baron Rothschild in Vienna. She's immensely wealthy and can support your boy. And Yossi's a little taken aback. It's a startling idea, I mean, attractive, but seemingly impractical. And he sort of stutters and said, well, isn't Vienna very far away? It has been, but there's a new train line coming and they're cutting the distance by 3/4. And he goes through a series of other objections and finally says, okay, you have my blessing. And to which the matchmaker said, fantastic, wonderful. That's half the job done. So that's the Palestinian problem. Yeah, obviously, you can list the conditions. They have been listed again and again and again at intervals since the Peel Commission in the 1930s.
Yes.
And they're never met because that's not what the daughter of Baron Rothschild in Vienna wants. That's not what this dispute is about. And it's tragic. It would be better if it were, but it's not. And by this point, after this has been after all these years of trying the same set of chess moves again and again, you have to realize, I think I may have misunderstood what this game is all about.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction to a Twitter post from the Canadian UN ambassador Bob Bray, who wrote the following quote: "An important step forward for Canada. Now the hard part starts, convincing Israel and Hamas to stop fighting and for Hamas to give up its arms, free the hostages, get the food in, start the task of mending and repairing, of truth, accountability, mutual
Yeah.
recognition, and making two states work."
Yeah.
And I responded, the hard part is doing a lot of work in that post. It strikes me as the foreign policy equivalent of the story of Economist who falls into a hole and assumes a ladder to
Yeah.
get out.
Or like telling the Corleone family that their cover story about caring for the needs and interests of Italian American widows and orphans would be so much more plausible if only they would admit the entire organized crime aspect. And no, that they're really committed to the organized crime, and the widows and orphan stuff is just a thin veneer covering what's really going on. So, uh, look, I think that one of the things you have to take seriously about Hamas is the "from the river to the sea" slogan.
Yes.
And what "from the river to the sea" means is we want everything or we want nothing. And we're prepared to accept the risk of nothing rather than ever yield on the dream of everything. And that is the tragic predicament here. Now, the thing that makes this whole thing so bizarre and seemingly incomprehensible to outsiders is outsiders look at the disproportion of strength and the ever-increasing strength of Israel and the extraordinary tactical and strategic successes of Israel since the October 7th attacks and say, don't you realize that if you say all or nothing, it's overwhelmingly probable you're
Yes.
going to get nothing. So
Yes.
shouldn't you take something rather than hold on to this crazy dream that you're going to get everything? And it is a bad calculus, but you have to at some point say, they really are serious. It's everything or nothing. That's their position, and they're prepared to accept nothing.
I want to take up your first explanation for a moment and drill in a bit because the Liberal Party's shift away from being a strong supporter of Israel didn't happen overnight. It strikes me as part of a longer term trend involving demographics as well as broader shifts in progressive politics around the
Yeah.
Anglo-American world. In that sense, David, is this bigger than the Liberal Party in a way?
Yeah, I think that yes, you're exactly right. And they're trying to ride something, and France and the French government and the Starmer government in Britain are in the same predicament. It's Immigration is a big part of the story. These countries have received a lot of immigrants from the Muslim world, many of which adopt in their new countries a policy much more radical than they would ever have back home, where they were consumed with more familiar and traditional political institutions and grievances, and so it becomes a kind of Palestine becomes in new places for people who are originally from Algeria or Morocco or Pakistan and who were at home very remote from this dispute, but it becomes a badge of identity. But what is also intensifying this, as you just said, are changes in what progressive movements are saying. That the as progressivism becomes ever less an economic agenda, yes, and ever more an identity agenda, that progressives who want to who say, look, our grievance is 1492. Now, what we're really bothered about is the European settlement of the rest of the world, and particularly North America, and we want to undo that. But obviously, that's not workable. The United States and Canada and Australia, they're probably not going anywhere. But what we can see, we can associate the creation of the state of Israel to all these things that we don't like that have happened over the past 500 years.
Yes.
And we can also, with this, not just appeal to our tiny progressive faction, because if we say our goal is no more United States, we'll look like maniacs. But we can then form this coalition on the one hand with these immigrants from the Islamic world who discover a new identity in the West, and on the other hand with traditional kinds of anti-Semitic rightists. I mean, it is very striking that photograph that has been so much discussed of the boy with this inherited condition who even though he's posed beside people who are obviously fully fed, he has become this signifier of terrible starvation. In the photographs, he's posed like a pieta. And that there is a fathomless demand in the Western world for the myth of the sinless sufferer tormented by cruel Jews. And that is a foundational myth. And anytime you can feed into that idea of the sinless sufferer who's tormented by cruel Jews, there's just centuries of geologic wealth that you can tap into. And even people who think I'm immune to this, I've left it behind. Maybe my great grandfather thought that way. Maybe that's 100 years ago. I don't think that way. In many people, it's waiting to be activated.
As you mentioned, Prime Minister Carney's announcement, David, followed similar ones from Britain and France.
Yeah.
How much should we understand Canada's position as part of a broader agenda by the Carney government to tie its foreign policy to the European Union? If
Yeah.
so, what are the pros and cons of such an approach?
Yeah. Well, it's a sign in some ways, I think I've said this to you before, of Carney's traditionalism, that he thinks, what is Canada about? It's about Britain and France.
Hmm.
And that's kind of nice. That at least connects to Canada's history. But he has this idea, I think the idea, and it is originally, I think, a French idea. That's maybe why it's so both elegant, complicated, and impossible all at the same time. That what you're going to do is Britain, France, and Canada will pressure Israel to do a deal with the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, but with the Palestinian Authority on these terms. And the
Yes.
Arab League will put pressures on Hamas to do a deal with the Palestinian Authority. And the whole thing will come together, and no one will ever quite admit what they're doing, but through this constellation of forces, that will somehow empower a renovated Palestinian Authority, bring moral suasion to bear on Hamas to submit to the Palestinian Authority, and we will achieve the two-state solution of everybody's dreams. And it has to be said, if it worked, it would be lovely. It would be lovely. I mean, a high-speed rail from Cairo to Damascus, a single labor market in what is now Israel and the West Bank, people commuting to work at factories and labs, fantastic. And people laying aside religious grievances and focusing on economic betterment. Who isn't for all of that? You just run into the fact that the only people who are not for it are the people you need to convince.
Yes, yes. I want to ask you, David, if we were to steelman the Carney government's decision,
Yeah.
to what extent is Israel's government itself responsible for the war's declining support around the world, including in Canada? Was it inevitable, or did the government make strategic mistakes along the way?
In every war, there are terrible, terrible mistakes. Dieppe was a mistake.
Yes.
And Canadians paid for it. And mistakes don't invalidate the conflict, although they bring suffering and harm to the people who are victims of the mistakes, and they slow down progress. I think one of the things that is always a factor in these wars that Israel's had to fight is Israel always has to go slower and use less force than a comparably powerful state would do, because they depend on the rest of the world. They're under so much scrutiny. And so that means that its wars always unfold in slow motion. So the Band-Aid is always peeled off as slowly and painfully as possible. Yes, if somebody had committed an equivalent atrocity to any other comparable, the war would have been over a lot faster, and it would have been the suffering would have been as intense, but it would have been compressed into a short period of time. But because Israel has this unique responsibility, fight the war, get your people back, but also take care of the civilian population that are under the sovereignty or under the control of the people you're fighting against. Therefore, go slow, block off areas, have areas where there isn't fighting. All of this means the war takes a lot longer, and so the suffering is extended over time. And the project of fighting an underground in-tunnel war against a completely unscrupulous enemy, while also feeding and caring for the population that is under that enemy's control and may owe loyalty to that enemy.
Yes.
I'm not going to sit here and say, I'm very mindful of the old joke attributed. The general says, "Well, the reason I didn't do better was because all the best generals were writing for the newspapers." They had a really hard problem, and you can imagine, with the perfect knowledge of after the fact, you can be smart after the fact. But there's David French, a friend of mine, wrote a column for the New York Times about how the Israelis didn't use the clear, hold, and build strategy that was tried in Iraq. Well, it didn't work. That strategy didn't work so great in Iraq. And anyway, Iraq is very different. There's a lot more open space in Iraq than there is in Gaza. I think, it's hard to criticize when people are in such a desperate situation against such an implacable, remorseless, conscienceless enemy.
One final question on this part of the show before we pick up again on the back half. We've been talking, David, about the Carney government's decision to recognize Palestinian statehood, driven in part by developments in the world of progressive politics in Canada and elsewhere. I'd be remiss though if I didn't ask you about anti-Israel or anti-Zionist sentiment on parts of the right. I've
Yeah.
noted, for instance, particularly among younger American conservatives, there's not the same instinct to
Yeah.
support Israel in this war. Why don't you talk a bit about that? What explains it, and what may be the long-term consequences for Israel
Yeah.
in DC?
Look, this is an old observation that uh, the parts of the political spectrum that are most comfortable with Jews and Jewish aspirations are the parts that believe in free markets, free minds,
Hmm.
free labor, um, free speech, and that spectrum of the middle, the liberal, in the broadest sense of the term, liberal middle, is being devoured in our time from a progressive left and a increasingly fascist right. So is it shocking to me that a right that is increasingly enthralled with authoritarian ideas, reactionary nationalism, is decreasingly sympathetic to Jews? You know, we've seen this movie before,
Yes.
and it's quite self-conscious. I mean, I'm struck by that one of the most popular podcasters, um, who I think is under 35, is just recycling old David Irving Nazi apologetics, and to a new market. And you think, like, did we not? I mean, my God, Irving, was found at court to have altered his evidence and to be a liar. But no, here he is. David Irving is back, and the larger project of Nazi apologetics is back, and there's a new audience for it.
Yes.
Uh, we are in a post-liberal period, and what post-liberal
Yes.
means is illiberal.
Yes.
And what illiberal means is often anti-Semitic, and there's some powerful reasons here. So the developments that are happening on the right are very alarming. You and I talk a lot about them, and but it is not a surprise that if you're walking down this path, that anti-Semitic mythology will be a feature.
Let's pause on that note for our free audience. We'll pick up the show in the second half, exclusive for Hub Heroes and Fellows. If you want to listen to David's views on the consequences of the Carney government's announcement, you can subscribe at www.thehub/join right now to get the full versions of In Conversation with David Frum and other exclusive content. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.